different countries, Ms. Schmitt?
Unfortunately, I don't know that true answer. I can speak on the fact that I have been in other countries and have been at competitions that have been tested. It is not the same protocols that we have had here at USADA.
That's your testimony, correct?
Correct. All of my tests are public record, so you want to go on and see how many I've been tested, how many times I've been tested, you can. And I know for a fact that isn't across the board for every other country in the world.
Isn't WADA supposed to set those ground rules for all competitors?
Yes.
And have they not even followed through with the consistent testing protocols for each country? And they're supposed to monitor compliance on that?
Supposed to, yes, ma'am.
So, Ms. Schmitt, talk to us about the testing. You've gone into a little bit of detail, but what does that, Mr. Phelps said that he operated under a constant suspicion of doping out there. What's your mindset as you go through the testing, and how frequent is it? And get into a little more detail just on the frequency and the type of testing.
I can say I have had hundreds and hundreds of tests since I've been in the pool in 2007. And that's all the way up until 2022, a year after the Tokyo Olympics. I was being tested, and I have never had a positive test, and I have always been willing to have tests at any time.
You said that's to ensure you said fair competition is worth the sacrifice of doing that.
Yes, it is what I knew at 17 years old, 16 years old, that I was signing my privacy, my rights away for fair sport and clean sport. And that's what we were working for, and that was my dream as a little kid, is to be in a level playing field. And as an adult in competing, I know that I was not in a level playing field, but I knew that I was clean myself, and I had worked for every record or medal and yard that we did.
We're proud of you for doing that.
Thank you.
Mr. Phelps, so that you said that, when did you become aware that the rules were different as you headed into these international competitions? And you said that constant suspicion of doping was kind of impacted you along the way.
Sure. I mean, if you go back, we were talking to Allison Wagner here, who swam in 1996. There were doping allegations and positive tests in 1992 and 96 and 2000 from the Italian team. 2004 from the Greek team, 2008, I don't know, 2012, I'm sure there was something, then 2016 you have the Russians, right? And now we have the Chinese all over again. So for me, it is rather frustrating that over time, I never have felt like I was competing in a clean field. In the US, yes, I do believe that, because you heard what Allison and I go through when we subject ourselves to these testing. There are times where I would be blood and urine tested twice a day, one by USADA, one by WADA. And they could be within a 30-minute window. They're taking 4 to 6 vials of blood every time they test. After every single world record I ever break, same thing, vials of blood and then urine. It's not the same for everybody else.
How short-sighted is it to undermine the integrity of an international competition like the Olympics? If scandals like this proliferate, then what happens to fair competition and in the interest of the public and all of us?
It's a great question, and honestly, I think if we continue to let this slide any farther, the Olympic Games might not even be there. I think there could be a possibility where there are other avenues that people try instead of trying to do it the right way. And as a kid growing up, again, you heard my dream was to wear the Stars and Stripes and stand on top of that podium and listen to my national anthem play. And I will tell you what, over a 20-year career, I got to do it a lot, and it was really awesome. But also, like Allison said, I outworked any single human on this planet, and that's a fact. And that's why I got the results that I got. And for me, I don't want kids growing up thinking that it's only doping and cheating where you're able to do these unfathomable things. Because people told me my whole entire life I would never amount to anything. I used that as motivation. In my career, I guess I won a couple gold medals, so it was a good career, and I had fun doing it. But for the future, again, this has to change. and it has to change now.
Thank you.
Each one of us has been a little boy or a little girl who has had a dream. Now, Michael and I have had a dream in this sport and in the Olympic space. And to be robbed as a little kid, that there is not a clean playing field and a fair playing field, that's robbing little girls and little boys of their dreams.
Well put, and now recognize Ms. Rogers for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. Phelps, the last time you testified before this committee, 7 years ago, you testified, quote, "For me as a father now, I don't know what or how I would even talk to my son about doping in sports. I would hope to never have that conversation, and I hope we can get it clear and cleaned up by then." Mr. Phelps, has the problem of doping in sports been cleaned up, where you can tell your sons that athletic competitions are fair and clean of cheating?
No.
From your standpoint, what is preventing competitions from being fair and free of illegal performing enhancing drugs?
I think lack of level playing fields, lack of rule following across the board, right? You know, I mean, you heard the schedule that we have to give every hour of every single day. They have to know exactly where we are. USADA knows exactly where we are. And again, we are okay with that. If everybody else is doing that, then that's what I want, right? I want to be able to stand up to the block with somebody next to me and be like, all right, cool, this is me versus you. It's not me versus you and 7 other drugs. So, yeah.
So would you just describe how vigorous a little bit the U.S. anti-doping agency testing standards are, and just how often you were tested throughout your career?
I would say on an average, I was tested 4 to 6 times a month, sometimes more, depending on if I was competing or not. When I was competing, it was pretty much every single session. It was the random testing, which again, I'm okay with. And yeah, I mean, it's you know, sometimes it's at 6 o'clock in the morning and we're getting up out of bed on our day off in Colorado Springs, knocking on the door, we have to do a drug test, fine, no problem. But it's literally, I mean, for my whole career, I'm probably one of the highest tested athletes that we have. Is that fair to say, Travis? Yeah? So, you know, so it's, you know, again, if everybody else isn't doing that and I'm subjecting myself to it, it's just not right. You know, and I know that there are other athletes as well. My competitors from the U.S. were going through the same exact thing, right? Ryan Lochte, going through the same exact thing. We were number 1, number 2 in the world, right? We're going through the same exact process. But somebody else who's number 3 in the world or number 4 in the world, number 5 in the world, they might have 2 or 3 drug tests, that's it. And they might not be random, right? So, yeah, it's hard for me to fathom that we have made changes moving forward, but I think we need to now.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Tygart, why does the World Anti-Doping Agency's explanation for why they ignored positive test results from 23 swimmers on Team China not hold up, in your opinion?
Well, it's absolutely against the rules. Even if you buy this contamination theory, and keep in mind, TMZ is a controlled prescription medication. It's prohibited all the time. The default sanction is 4 years. It doesn't magically appear fairy dust in a kitchen of a hotel 3 months after this event happened during COVID, when cleaning protocols were at the height of what they were. So, but however, even if you believe this contamination theory, they still didn't follow the rules. And WADA has now admitted that China did not follow the rules. Because even if it's contamination that caused the positive test, and there are some of those cases. We have some meat contaminants, and these are drugs that cattle is treated with. And if you eat that oxtail, for example, it may cause a very, very low level of a positive test. We understand that. That happens. However, if that happens, it still has to be announced. There's transparency in the system. There's still disqualification, and there's still a violation. And that did not happen, even if you buy this crazy contamination theory.
So what should have they done?
They absolutely should have appealed the lack of a provisional suspension when the notice of the positive tests were first sent. And if they were going to let the Chinese handle the case, WADA has the power to go in and grab a case out of a national organization's hands, and they handle it themselves in the first instance. And they probably should have done that when they saw that China wasn't giving their athletes due process. There was no B samples. They didn't give notice to the athletes. There was no provisional suspension, which is mandatory. But given that they didn't do that, when they then got the full file that demonstrated China swept these under the rug and didn't follow the rules, they should have immediately appealed those to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, like they do in hundreds of cases
Thank you.
on
Are
an
any
annual
of
basis.
those athletes competing in Paris?
11 of them have made the team now, competing in Paris.
Ms. Schmitt, what does ignoring 23 positive tests do to trust in anti-doping agencies responsible for holding up the integrity, especially for clean athletes that compete the right way?
There is no trust. And what we ask for is that trust for accountability and transparency. We don't have accountability, and we don't have transparency as we have not seen the full files.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back now, recognizing the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up what Chair Rogers said and what Mr. Tygart said about this, what happened. It seems to me that the water code, that the rules, outline in specific detail how anti-doping violations are supposed to be processed and reported. The problem is they're not enforced, or they weren't enforced, and the lack of transparency. So if you, Mr. Tygart, just again explain quickly what would have happened in your opinion, or what should have happened in your opinion, following Shinada's receipt of the positive test, which of course we didn't know about because there was a lack of transparency. But what should have happened following the receipt of the positive test from these 23 different Chinese swimmers in January of 2021?
Yeah, given that this drug is such a potent performance-enhancing drug that's banned at all times, not just during the competition, but you can't take it during training because it can help you during training for recovery and cardiac efficiency, which is critical to performance at an event later. They should have immediately provisionally suspended the athletes, take them off the playing field. That's mandatory under the rules. That was not done. WADA has the appeal right when anti-doping organizations like China in this case fail to impose a mandatory provisional suspension. WADA should have immediately appealed that, like they did in the Russian figure skater case, if you remember. Exactly. She was not provisionally suspended by Russia, surprise, and they appealed that. Same drug, same level of drug. And then when they got the full case file, if they weren't going to grab it out of China's hands themselves, like I just described in the prior question, they should have immediately appealed China's sweeping these under the rug. And WADA has now admitted that China did not follow the rules. They had to find a violation, they had to publicly announce it, and they had to disqualify these swimmers, and they did not do that. And that's if you believe the contamination theory, which is a whole nother...
But in other words, those things should have happened even before they assessed the banned substance or the responsibility, right?
That's exactly right.
Even before. Now, let me ask you this. I mentioned in my opening that WADA now has supposedly had some independent Swiss company, do some sort of independent analysis of what they should have done or what they did wrong. Yep. And I said that should be made public. Suppose they're going to get it by the end of this month, but they haven't agreed to make it public. Right. So I guess my question is, if they, again, this goes to the transparency, if they made that public and it said you didn't follow the rules, which you clearly say they didn't, then could they go back and reopen the case?
Absolutely, and thank you for that. It's really, really important. This, we believe, and we said it when they first announced this Cartier investigation, that it's a whitewash. We've seen these before. My guess is they will make some of that public. They may make the whole thing public. But what we are asking for to be made public is the actual evidence in the files so that independent people can determine. And yes, the statute of limitations in these cases has not run.
So they could reopen?
Absolutely.
Now, let me ask you this. If they reopened the case and found out that these athletes should have been suspended, let's go the next step. Could they then recommend to the International Olympic Committee that the medals be taken away?
Listen, how the rules, unfortunately, what happened. Where we are now is that athletes and others around the world deserve justice on those cases themselves. Statute of limitation has not run. We need a prosecutor to go in and look at the facts, get independent advice, investigate, check to see if all these athletes actually stayed in the hotel.
But what I'm asking you,
And then you
I
can
know
bring
you're
the
not
case.
recommending this, but it is possible for them to reopen the case.
Absolutely.
Determine that they should have been suspended, and then recommend to the International Olympic Committee that they should be, the medals should be taken away.
Under the rules, once that legal process has been followed, then it's automatic disqualification if there's a suspension put in place, such as the
And then the-
Valieva Russia case where she's been suspended, got a 4-year sanction. Now our athletes are moving from silver to gold in the figure
And
skating.
the International Olympic Committee could then determine that and say.
They have to follow what the Court of Arbitration for Sport would say. But the athletes deserve their due process. Let's make no mistake about that. The Chinese athletes, that was robbed of them at the time. But the statute of limitations has not told. And if there are violations that deserve something longer than just a disqualification and an announcement, then that can still be put in place.
That's one way of achieving justice,
That's-
and maybe
that's-
setting an example, that we're going to take these medals away, and you shouldn't violate the rules.
Congressman, that's why we have been pushing so hard from the very beginning for an independent prosecutor to get access to the cases themselves, not a report that WADA does, but the actual evidence in the cases, interview the whistleblowers, which was not done, and determine whether or not it is fair to bring cases against those 23 athletes, and if a sanction, the 4-year default sanction, should be put in place, or if it is contamination. And listen, if it is contamination and the evidence proves that, USADA, myself, we will be the first to raise our hand and say, you know what, that's contamination. Sorry, you got silver medal and you should be happy with it, but you weren't robbed. But until that happens, this will haunt our athletes and athletes from around the world for the rest of their lives.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields
Sorry if
back.
we went over.
Now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Health, Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And I'd like to address this to Mr. Phelps and Ms. Schmitt. My understanding is athletes who are doping on banned substances do everything they possibly can to avoid the regulators and not get detected. I know, and I appreciate both of you standing here and saying that everything you've done has been because of your hard work. That's admirable. I appreciate it. But I know you've been around some people who have probably or know of situations. And could you share some of the ways athletes try to hide the fact that they're using bad substances, or they try to trick testers and regulators? And also, so how do they do it? And based on your experiences, are cheaters often a step ahead of the regulators?
You can go.
I mean, I don't really know how to be honest, right? I would assume, I've heard back in the day with I guess there were just pills that were administered. I'm talking like this is Icarus, like way back then. Like people were just giving pills and you're just going and drinking and that's it. Like you don't ask questions. Other than that, like I have no idea. I don't know where to get it. I don't know I know nothing. I mean, I did what I do best, and that was work as hard as I could every single day and stare at a black line and sometimes talk to it every now and then, but you realize it doesn't talk.
Well, I
back
understand
to you.
that, but sometimes understanding how people get around the system helps us figure out how to fix it.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume they're masking agents, right? This might be a question better for you than me, but I assume they're masking agents that people can do this or that, or I'm not the
You
right
just don't know.
person
You're
to
not
ask.
familiar.
Yeah,
Well, it's
no,
good that
sorry.
you're not, but I hope maybe you heard secondhand. Have you heard anything secondhand how that would work?
I've never heard anything, but I mean, we have finished thousands of yards of practices and have felt bricks in our arms. We've woken up for 5:15 a.m. practices, diving in the water at 5:15 with sore bodies, with legs that we have to walk backwards down the stairs because they feel like Jell-O. So, like Michael said, if I have ever heard of anything, we would go right to USADA.
So people who get away with doping are just the regulators are not regulating. I mean, there's not a way around it. Either they're just not checking them. Is that what you're?
Listen, I would say, and we should take some consolation, right, that whistleblowers have come forward and exposed deep state-sponsored doping in Russia. Holy cow, that's been exposed, and that was not dealt with as effectively as it should have been.
I guess that's what I'm trying to expose. These are intentional regulating agencies that just allow it to happen.
Here is the problem, is that the global regulator that's supposed to be the global referee to ensure that every country is being held to the same standards, we now have another example. Russia was one. We now have another example that whistleblowers in the media, just like Russia, exposed of them not doing the job.
So it's
There
not
were
been able
positive
to
tests.
It's not been able to to sum up. And I'm going to go ahead and yield because I know we're against a time for you, a couple of you guys and others want to. But so to sum it up is that they're not been able to mask their doping. Are these regulating agencies, China and Russia, we know, are allowing it?
More importantly, the World Anti-Doping Agency.
Is turned their blind eye to them allowing
You got it.
All right,
You got
thank
it.
you. And I will yield.
Russia and China have been too big to fail in their eyes, and they get a different set of rules than the rest of the world does, unfortunately.
I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Ms. Dingell for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'm the co-chair of the Bipartisan and Bicameral Congressional Olympic and Paralympic Caucus. And my constituents and I are very proud that USADA, the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and so many Olympic athletes call Colorado home. I will apologize for the 6 a.m. wake-ups, but, that's out of my hands. As you heard from this panel, we had a hearing in 2017 when I was the ranking member of this subcommittee and Mr. Tygart and Mr. Phelps were here, about the revelation of the systematic doping among the Russian athletes. That led to Russia's being banned from the Olympics for several years. And at that hearing, there were some serious questions raised about the effectiveness of the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, and it's kind of poignant that there they are or not, and they haven't come here to explain themselves. But after that hearing, Mr. Tygart, you will remember this, we felt like maybe they didn't have enough resources. Right. We felt like that was the problem, right?
Yep.
And so the U.S. now contributes nearly $4 million in dues to WADA, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And that was in response to the concerns about their ability to finance themselves, right?
That's right.
But how does our contribution compare to other countries' dues paid to WADA?
So we are the single highest payer, U.S. taxpayer,
Right.
on the government side. That's matched by the IOC. The IOC overall is the largest payer, about half of WADA's $53 million budget. But you'll remember, to your point about what WADA asked for when they did have the decency and respect to show up here and answer questions under oath, that they asked for three things. One, they wanted authority to investigate and investigators.
Correct.
They wanted a compliance process, and they
Correct.
wanted a process to handle effectively whistleblowers.
Right. So
They got all three, and a 60% increase in their budget
Right.
to
So-
handle that.
so-
those weren't used in this case whatsoever.
Right. So that this case and the problems we have has nothing to do with the funding that we're giving them. Isn't that right?
I think absolutely not.
Okay. Now, I also found out that in 2018 and 2019, coincidentally, China paid WADA nearly $2 million more than their required annual dues payments. Remember that? Overpayment?
Unfortunately, I do.
And as we now learn, that was right before these doping investigations. Is that right?
And even worse, 500,000 of that, close to 2 million extra payments, was specifically given, earmarked for investigations. And now knowing that they didn't open an investigation into these cases, I'm not suggesting, I don't have evidence of a quid pro quo.
You don't have to suggest anything. I think we'll just let that sit there.
The optics and the perception of fairness and being objective,
too good.
unbiased is horrendous and,
Yeah,
and
not too
incredibly troubling.
Okay. Another development since the 2017 hearing was the Rodchenkov Anti-Doping Act, which was a bill I co-led in the House with some other people, actually signed into law. That law makes it a crime to engage in a doping scheme at any international sports competition that is broadcast in the U.S., sponsored by a U.S. company, or in which U.S. athletes participate. Mr. Phelps, do you know about that law?
No.
Okay.
I don't.
And I'm not going to. But do you think a law that would do what I just said would be helpful for athletes who dope?
I do, yeah. I mean, because they're replicated, or excuse me, there's something that happens, right? Like, they're going to get punished for it. Like, right now, people are just getting away with everything. You know, there are
Right.
people who are still testing positive that are still having the opportunity to compete internationally.
Right.
What?
Not from the
that's
U.S.,
No,
though.
not from the U.S., no.
Right.
But from all over the world. And how is that possible?
Right.
Like, it just makes no sense. I'm one that, if somebody does test positive, I would like to see a lifetime ban. Cut and
Yeah.
dry, right? Like, and obviously, to Travis, you know, what Travis is saying, you have a lot of contamination issues. Obviously, things happen. But if somebody is going out of their way to single-handedly cheat, Go.
Lifetime ban.
Yeah, lifetime ban.
What do you think, Ms. Schmitt?
I agree and echo what they're saying. I think there should be a zero tolerance policy.
Internationally.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We may have to have you back again, I can imagine, but we will continue to chip away at this. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you all for everything today. Thank you so much.
Recognize Mr. Duncan, Chairman of the Energy Sub, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, and I'll thank Ms. Tygart for that information. That was, wow. I want to discuss what the World Anti-Doping Agency cited as to why they didn't have to investigate the 23 Chinese swimmers who tested positive. First off, is any of this normal? I mean, if you worked at WADA and one day you get over 20 positive tests, all from one country, in this case China, in a 1-week span, is that a normal day at the office, or would this have raised an eyebrow or two? Mr. Phelps?
It does raise an eyebrow because I think for 3 years, nobody said anything about it, right? So that's kind of bizarre. I mean, do I believe there is doping in sports? Of course. I mean, you've heard me say I don't believe I've ever competed in a clean field. So I think there is doping across the board, but I don't know.
It's not normal, and it absolutely should have raised the reddest of all flags to the tallest of all
20 from one country in 1 week.
Absolutely, particularly for this drug that less than 9 months earlier, they met with a whistleblower who defected from China, who they found credible, told them that they were giving low levels and undetectable levels of this very drug to their athletes to cheat. Wow. So how that didn't result in an immediate investigation, immediate grabbing of that case to be prosecuted effectively is why we're here.
Yeah.
And why we need answers.
That's why we're here, Mr. Phelps.
Is it still the same where if one delegation has 4 drug tests, they skip the next Olympics? Is that right?
Depending on the sport, but
Okay. Because throughout, when I was swimming, I was always under the, like, if 4 of our athletes tested positive in one Olympic, or one quad, 4 swimmers test positive in one quad, we're done. We can't compete in the Olympics. They had 23. They competed in that Olympics, and they have the opportunity to still compete at this Olympics in Paris.
Wow.
And don't think for a second, if I may, that is a terrible day if you're WADA to receive notice of 23 positive tests. They were going to have to likely gut the Chinese swim team going into the 2021 Olympics.
Why didn't they?
As well as 2022, China was going to host the winter. This is the question. This is what we're asking. Like Russia, are they too big to fail? And that's why you turned a blind eye and allowed them to not follow the rules and sweep these positive tests under the rug. That's the very question we are here for and want and need answers to.
I agree on the lifetime ban. Aside from the Russian doping scandal, have any of you ever heard of over 20 positive tests not being investigated? I got a no from Mr. Phelps. Ms. Schmitt? No. One of the reasons they cited for not investigating 23 swimmers who tested positive was because they were, quote, in the same place at the same time when the positive samples arose, end quote. Can each of you tell me if that is a good excuse not to investigate over 20 cases?
Listen, in our Lance Armstrong case, the team stayed together so that they could dope together. They rode a bus together so they could do blood transfusions together. The fact that they all stayed at the same hotel and all tested positive is not a fact that is consistent with not doping. It's a fact consistent with intentional doping.
Team that travels together, dopes together. Would COVID-19 restrictions have prevented the World Anti-Doping Agency from effectively and thoroughly investigating these positive tests?
I would just say 3,500 athletes in February of 2022, so just a few months later, came into Beijing and competed in the Winter Olympic Games without any problem. They could have easily gone in 2 or 3 people to interview. They could have done Zoom interviews. So it's not an excuse. Athletes don't want an excuse that COVID prevented them from lifting a finger. They didn't even open a factual investigation. They've acknowledged that. And COVID and the fact that it might have been difficult to get into China during that time because everywhere was difficult to get into is not a valid excuse that answers the questions for why athletes weren't held to the same rules.
Yeah. I'm a former athlete, and I want a level playing field as you do. I've got a little bit of time left. Ms. Schmitt, do you want to add anything? Do you have any comments you want to add?
I'm grateful for this opportunity, and like all of us up here state that we just want fairness in sport. Like you stated, we want fairness in sport. And sport has given me so many opportunities, and I hope that I can have children that are in sport that have opportunities and know that they're competing on a fair playing field.
Thank you. Mr. Baca, your lack of being here speaks volumes. Mr. Chairman, you go back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Ms. Schakowsky for her 5 minutes of question.
She's up.
There we go. I want to tell you what an honor it is to be with these amazing athletes and experts today. And I want to make the point that it's not just about the athletes. I want to talk about the fans, about the people, about the Americans. We love the Olympics. We love to cheer at the gold medals. It's a really important time. And so the issue of trust is so incredibly important. I want to just say a few things to Ms. Schmitt. You are such a role model for so many people. I think women look up to you. They listen to you and they want to follow in your footsteps. So what I want to ask is not just what you think should be done to correct the wrongs that have been, but what are you saying right now to inspire the athletes that are going forward now, that are working? Both of you have been talking about the incredible effort that goes into over years and years to get ready for the Olympics. So how do you inspire the young women who are considering being there and hoping to be there right now?
Thank you. I appreciate those words. I'm honored to hear those words. And I hope that I can sit here and empower others to use their voice. So often our voices are lost, especially as athletes, especially as female athletes. We know our bodies and we know the work that we put in. So to be able to stand up and use your voice and do the best that you can at any level is what I hope that I can empower others to do as well.
Thank you. Mr. Phelps, you hinted about sort of mental state is really important. So has that now been diminished? Is this going to affect our athletes? Well, I guess I'm just assuming, and I'll ask Mr. Tygart whether or not we're going to see the corrections that we need right now. But how important, aside from the workouts and all the expertise, is the mental state of the athletes?
For sure. I mean, I can touch on sort of just mental health and kind of my own experience through it. You know, I'm somebody who suffers from depression and anxiety, and I know there are a lot of people that mental health has struck into their lives because of COVID and everything we've gone through. I think loneliness has struck in people's lives more than it ever has before, and that leads to depression. So, and then you put all of that on top of you trying to prepare, and all these people around you are doing all of these things to get an edge. It's going to weigh extra on you, right? So for me, one of my things every single day that I'd like to lower, and I'd like to have some kind of involvement in lowering, is the suicide rate. I can tell you this, we've lost way too many of our Olympic brothers and sisters due to suicide. So this is something that I want to be a part of and I want to make a difference in. But when we keep having things like this, there are going to still have things that we need to address, and the mental state is very sensitive. So I think this is definitely playing a toll on a lot of people's mental state. But I think some people look at it as it's something that's out of our control. That was something that I looked at a lot throughout my career, was what can I control every single day? If I can control myself and be the best version of myself, that should be good enough. And I think people are doing that now, and people are cheating, and that needs to change. So I think that's why we're here today, trying to fight for that change for the next generation.
Well, there's certainly bipartisan support here, but Mr. Tygart, is this going to happen in time during these Olympics right now?
The window is closing. I think back when this first was exposed and we called for the independent prosecutor to get justice in the 23 cases, there was time. But this close to the games, I'm afraid there's not. And unfortunately, the World Anti-Doping Agency has dug its heels in, has said they would do this all over again. They would not change. So the likelihood that this self-selected review that they have going is going to result in anything of material outcome that will be beneficial for getting to the truth, I'm sorry to say, but I'm highly skeptical that it's just going to be the whitewash that we predicted. And so no. But this cannot die just because the Olympic Games come, because it's a pattern of behavior that we have seen going back to at least Russia in 2014, 2015, when it was first exposed by whistleblowers in the media, not by WADA, to get this fixed, particularly given these events are coming to the U.S. like never before over the next 10 years.
Well, I have a grand nephew who has aspirations to be a swimmer, and I want him to feel trust. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Mr. Palmer for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to a point raised by Representative Dingell about the fact that China gave an additional $2 million to WADA, but they did that right before clearing the athletes, but there was also something else that took place right after they gave the money, and that was International Olympic Committee member Yang, Chinese committee member, was elected vice president. She was just in 22 reelected to her second 3-year term, and it raises serious questions in my mind about the fact that I think WADA has been compromised, and particularly in clearing the 23 swimmers. They relied on the Chinese anti-doping. I think their assertion was that they had collectively been exposed to a banned heart medication. Mr. Phelps, do you consider WADA an effective regulator for Olympic athletes?
I don't have many positive things to say about them.
All right, and we're going to stop the clock for just a second so we're not eating up your time. Mr. Phelps has given me the signal that he has stayed over graciously, but he has now got to leave. Did you want to introduce your guests who are with you this evening before you have to leave?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you for having us back, and thank you for addressing this issue. We hope we don't come back in 7 years, but we know that you guys will fight with us if we do. So I just want to say thank you again for having you guys in our court, to doing what's right. And second, this is my better half, my wife, Nicole, and number 4, this is Nico, my little child behind us. So thank you all so much. And
Mr. Phelps, I was going to tell you, my neighbor was Rowdy Gaines, and he was a pretty good swimmer too.
Sir, yes, sir. I just spent time with him covering some of the Olympic trials, and we'll be over in Paris covering it together as well.
The only negative I have about Rowdy was he was an Auburn swimmer.
Yes, yep, yes, sir.
Played football at Alabama. He's a great guy.
Yes, sir.
Y'all did a nice job.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everything.
Thank you. And I was talking about the other time, not today particularly, when you were on doing the trials.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time is restarting. Go ahead.
I'd like to redirect to Mr. Tygart and Ms. Schmitt that same question, because considering the excess payment that China made in the election of Yang, and I'm not making any accusations against her, but it just seems incredibly more than coincidental that the payment was made, she was elected vice president, and they allowed basically the Chinese anti-doping agency to clear the 23 athletes. Do you consider WADA a legitimate regulator?
The issue, and in my written testimony and my oral testimony, it's the fox guarding the hen house. And when you have sport leaders who have an interest in the decision that they're making, that can't be an independent regulator. When you have people from the IOC, like the current vice president, from countries, China, and a big case like this comes through, and it's not handled according to the rules, of course the perception, if not the de facto conflict, is actual conflict, is just rife, and it erodes the confidence and the trust in the system by the athletes that you've heard from today and millions of athletes around the world.
Ms. Schmitt?
The first thing that comes to my mind is the mental health, especially in this China situation. It comes from both sides. I'm a huge advocate in mental health, and it comes from the China swimmer side of the pressures of hiding cheating and the pressures of that. And then it comes from the clean athlete side of being robbed from those victories and never having to be able to celebrate those victories at the time that we competed.
Let me be a little more direct about this. China is exerting enormous influence in a number of agencies, whether it's WADA, World Health Organization, other agencies. And I'm concerned that it's not the athlete's decision to take these drugs. And these drugs may give them an advantage, but it's also going to have some serious health consequences down the road because some of these performance-enhancing drugs impact the heart. It increases the capacity of the heart, and down the road, they're going to have some real issues. Have you, and you mentioned suicide, Ms. Schmitt, some of that may be because of the effects of having taken these PEDs.
Go ahead.
It's holding that standard. It's coming from, for us as U.S. athletes, it's coming from USADA, and to knowing that we're responsible for what we're putting in our body. And like I said, it's empowering ourselves to know what we're putting in our body, empowering ourselves to use our voice.
My question, since my time is limited, is are there countries, and in this case China, forcing their athletes to take these drugs? Because
what I would say is we absolutely, and we can't be naive that some of these countries, we saw it with the Russia state-sponsored doping affair, they see sport as an extension of their foreign affairs.
Exactly.
And it is a war to them, and they want to win, and they will use their athletes as their soldiers on the playing fields of the Olympic Games.
No, it's not
and we can't be naive to that, and it's exactly why we have to have a strong global referee to ensure that those countries don't gain an advantage that they don't deserve under the rules.
Yeah, it's not about competition, it's about supremacy. And they're willing to risk the long-term well-being of their athletes in an attempt to defeat all other nations in competitive sports. So I just think we're at a situation now, Mr. Chairman, where WADA there's a serious question as to the legitimacy of the organization. And I think it's going to impact the long-term future of Olympic sports. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Tonko of New York for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I want to echo my colleagues and register my disappointment, great disappointment, that the World Anti-Doping Agency refused to attend tonight's hearing. I would like to discuss how WADA handled the case of Russian figure skater Kamila Valieva. There are several similarities with that case and the case of the 23 Chinese swimmers. Following a positive test for TMZ in December of 21, Ms. Valieva was provisionally suspended before being cleared on appeal by the Russian anti-doping authorities. WADA appealed that decision, and in January of 2022, Valieva was found to have committed an anti-doping violation. Her penalty was a 4-year suspension, backdated to December of 21. Russia's gold medal was stripped and awarded to the U.S. Mr. Tygart, good to see you. I'm interested in understanding why WADA appealed in the Russian case, but not in the case involving the 23 Chinese athletes. Can you explain the key differences and similarities in the handling of these cases and indeed their significance?
And if we could cut there, Ms. Schmitt has indicated that it's time for her to go. Are you able to stay longer, or are you ready to go?
Yes, I have to go make my flight.
Okay.
Yes.
We appreciate it. We're going to come right back to you. Appreciate you being here as well. Did you have any guests that you wanted to introduce this evening that were with you?
I got people watching, so
Got people watching. There you go. And I have to tell you, I loved in your written statement about swimming not being being a no-cut sport. That's why I ended up being a swimmer and love it very much. But really appreciate you being here and your testimony.
Thank you. Yes, swimming is the one sport that is a life skill as well.
It is. And so even an old man like me can keep getting in the water and do a little bit. All right. Appreciate you being here this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mr. Tygart, did you need Mr. Tonko, before I turn the clock back on, did you need him to repeat his question?
I don't. I think I got it. So the similarities or the contrasts in WADA's handling of Valieva, very similar, if not identical facts. Low level of a potent drug that's prohibited at all times. The default sanction is 4 years. They appealed the lack of a provisional suspension in that case. They did not do that in these Chinese cases. We don't know why. In that case, when she was exonerated, although Russia even announced it, they didn't find a violation or give her a suspension in those cases. Russia even announced it. WADA then appealed that case to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. They prosecuted that case, and they got the default sanction that otherwise should have been put in place by Russia, which was 4 years. That was an example, while it took too long, that was an example where the WADA did its job as the global watchdog and enforced the rules against Russia as those rules should have been enforced. Identical substance, similar low level, this time 23 athletes. They didn't appeal the provisional suspension. When China swept these under the rug, which is against the rules, even if you believed it was contamination, they didn't appeal that. They let China do that and get away with it. How they justify treating these cases different than how they treated Valieva case is, again, incredibly troubling, and it's why we've asked for the full China dossier. If there are distinctions in there that make sense and that are comport with the rules, then we'll be the first to say that. But right now, they are so far away from that, is why we're here asking for assistance and help.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And let's take a look at another scenario. Mr. Tygart, you correctly mentioned in your written testimony that this is not the first time that this committee has addressed these issues. In 2017, we held a hearing to review WADA's role in response to the systematic doping that was uncovered in Russia. I believe that covered the area of 2014 to 2015, perhaps. What similarities or differences are there between that case and how WADA handled the case of the 23 Chinese swimmers?
I would say, well, first of all, it's both in the Russia case and now in this sweeping under the rug of 23 Chinese positive tests. It's been courageous whistleblowers in the media that have gotten this out in the public so that we can see what actually happened. In the Russia case, they turned a blind eye, and then when it was exposed, they attempted to limit it. They tried to put it in the rearview mirror as quickly as they could. They did a quote-unquote investigation. Once that exposed a little bit of the tip of the iceberg, athlete groups called for a broader investigation. They refused that. It was then media and whistleblowers who then blew it open to the extent we now know what was going on. WADA's hand was forced by whistleblowers to do the job that they're tasked and we pay them to do. Here again in China, we never would have known about these 23 cases being covered up in violation of the rules that WADA has now admitted China didn't follow the rules. WADA's admitted that, but they didn't do anything about it. How can that be? And how can it be that, again, it's courageous whistleblowers and the media that shine the light on the darkness and bring this out? So now I think we all, and our athletes, as you've clearly heard, deserve to know what the truth actually is, and justice needs to be served in addition to the reform that we've talked about.
Well, look, it's disappointing, and this inaction runs counter to the principles of transparency and fairness that are foundational for international competition. So I thank you for your responses to those questions, and thank you for your help in other areas of anti-doping legislation that we did in another industry, the horse racing industry. I appreciate the help. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize Ms. Lesko for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Tygart, thanks for sticking it out with us till almost 9
I think I have a plane to catch, actually.
Okay, well, I'll be.
I'm kidding. Maybe I wish I had a plane to catch. I'm not sure.
Well, if Mr. Phelps would still have been here, I want to put on the record that I want to thank him for his contribution to the Arizona community. He helps ASU swim team. His foundation also helps the Phoenix Children's Hospital, children swim education. So I want to put that on the record that I'm thanking him for that. Mr. Tygart, my question to you is, if 23 American swimmers tested positive for a banned substance, do you have any doubt that the World Anti-Doping Agency would have investigated U.S. swimmers?
I think it's pretty fair to say that if we had swept them under the rug, I think it's fair to say they would have done something different. But make no mistake, we would not have done that. We would have put in provisional suspensions as the rules, mandatory rules require. Those athletes would have been removed from the playing field. We would have investigated it. And if it was legit contamination, as the rules allow for, we would have announced it, disqualified the athletes, so those other athletes would have moved up. Let's not forget about those Chinese athletes who were third and fourth to the ones that got first and second, that tested and had positive tests. Those athletes should have rightfully moved up in their event, and WADA didn't protect their rights. So I think it would have been handled entirely differently and in accordance with what the rules require.
Do you think we should withhold U.S. funding from WADA until they turn over their case file on the Chinese swimmers who used illegal drugs?
It's a tough but really important question. I think where we are now, after Russia, after what we're seeing and their response to it, we have to have the leverage we need. I think other countries would join, and I think the threat of that, if not actually suspending it for a period of time, will go a long way into influence the truth being out. And that starts with the full China dossier, as well as not allowing them to make secret backroom deals anymore, and then doing a compliance audit. I think they're all very reasonable, and I think they're all very doable, and it should be, if we're going to invest in an organization that is supposed to do the job as the global regulator, we should ensure that our money is going for a good purpose, and right now it's just simply not, and that pattern of behavior is just too much to continue to do, I think.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I agree with Mr. Tygart. I think that we should withhold funding from WADA until they turn over the Chinese files and until they agree to an audit. And I hope that we can have Republican and Democrat support and talk to our appropriators about it. And with that, I yield back.
And for the folks watching back home, we do policy, appropriators do money, so we'll have to work with our appropriators on that. And now recognize Ms. Kamick for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for hanging in there with us, Mr. Tygart. And I will submit my questions for the record for our two athletes that were here with us, because I do think that there is some really important conversation to be had about the mental health that these cases and these situations are putting on our athletes. And I do agree with your assessment that many nations treat this as a geopolitical tool. They use their athletes effectively as foot soldiers to further their mission. So I agree that this is really important. I want to kind of dig into some of the nitty gritty. While you were speaking, we were talking a lot. We kept hearing about the zero tolerance policy. I just pulled up the IOC's website, and they say right there, point blank, we have a zero tolerance policy. What does that mean, especially in light of these 23 Chinese athletes that have popped positive on their drug test?
I think it's good PR. Honestly, I think, and that's what's so crushing about the Russia issue and this now China issue. We have to stop the charade. If we're going to fight to win, just like these two athletes give everything to be champions, those of us who are here to protect fairness in sport and the integrity of sport, particularly the Olympic movement, it's different, arguably, than pro sport. Right. We have to win this battle, not just attempt to give the appearance that were for zero tolerance, for example, or a lot of testing, for example.
Right.
We actually have to go out and try to win this for athletes.
So what is the relationship then between WADA and the International Testing Agency? They put out a very flowery press release talking about how they're ready for Paris. What exactly is that relationship? How do the two collaborate?
Yeah, so WADA, has an observer board seat on the International Testing Agency, but they also oversee them and the sports that the International Testing Agency runs. The IOC created and funds and has governing positions on the International Testing Agency. That said, they are definitely an improvement from what was there before, and they will be involved, hopefully in partnership with us, when the games come to LA 2028, and we hope to work effectively with them. WADA does not test. And it's sometimes a misnomer. They oversee the groups that test.
Right.
The International Testing Agency, along with USADA, CHINATA in China, USADA in Russia, WADA oversees us. WADA has to make sure we comply with the rules.
And the people who are testing, they're called the doping control officers, is
That's
that
right.
correct? So what is the nationality of these DCOs that come and test these athletes on a regular basis?
They can be from all over.
Is it more national? Are American DCOs testing American athletes, or is it kind of a hodgepodge? I'm trying to get a better sense of what it looks like.
Yeah, so we have employees that are doping control officers who, as you've heard, sometimes go into athletes' house at 6 o'clock in the morning and collect samples. The International Testing Agency sometimes they'll use us to do their testing when they test here in the United States. When Michael Phelps talked about he was tested and then 2 hours later he was tested again, that was the World Aquatics, I suspect, that came in and tested him afterward, and that was unbeknownst to us because they sent a third party in to do that kind of testing. And this is a really important point because while WADA has put out a lot of testing numbers by China, those, as we understand it, and we've investigated this, are all through the Chinese National Anti-Doping Agency. They don't have third parties that come in and do the testing. They're solely relying, as we understand it, on the Chinese Anti-Doping Agency, and they're only using the Chinese laboratory. We're here in the United States. One, we have 2 labs. 2, we allow foreign testers to come in and test in the U.S. if it's not a test that we're performing.
Well, and shouldn't that be a redundancy that the IOC adopts as just good standard practice?
It's a good check. It's a good check and balance.
So, I mean, the vetting, is there any vetting of or standards that are established by WADA for the DOCs?
There is a international standard for testing and investigations that all doping control officers have to go through, and it's a full background check. Here in the U.S., all of ours are Safe Sport certified, which is not the case around the world, unfortunately. Something that we're obviously very proud of, given the crisis and saga there and the victims that were deeply affected. Ours are employees, so we background checks, all of the things that you would do to ensure that the folks that are going in to test are actually trustworthy and can do the job at the level that they need to do the job.
Is there a follow-up standard, though? So it's kind of like you pass the background check and then you're off to the races, no pun intended. But is there continual follow-up of, are these people compromised? Because, I mean, this is, at the highest levels. Is there any follow-up with these DCOs along the way?
Yeah, for sure. For at least here in the United States, I couldn't speak to what happens necessarily around the world, but there's evaluation, constant athlete feedback, correction if there's, conformities, minor conformities that need to be dealt with, but constant oversight to make sure we've got the best people in the trenches doing that kind of work, because that's the first leg of the testing process. If you have bad collections, if you give advance notice, then it's only as good as, ultimately what you're going to collect, which athletes can find ways to defeat the system if they're given that advance notice.
I'm getting the signal that my time has expired. I have some remaining questions that I will submit for the record. Thank you for your time and for appearing before the committee today. We appreciate it. I yield.
Gentlelady is back. Now waving on to the committee, we recognize Ms. Barragan, who's been here since the beginning, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee for allowing me to wave on today. As a kid, I was a swimmer myself. Oh. My mother almost drowned when she was a kid, so she made sure that all of her kids would have the opportunity to learn how to swim. And once a year, I would perform in a big competition, And so as a kid, you watch the Olympics and you watch swimming, and it's so inspirational to see our athletes do this and perform, and we don't really understand or know the sacrifices that are made. And to hear today about those sacrifices and their dreams of standing on the podium and wearing the stripes, which is so patriotic, us as members of Congress who represent the United States need to do all we can to make sure we have their back and that they know we have their back. And that they do that and they know that so that they continue to compete and push to make sure that America is at the top of that podium. Mr. Tygart, you have told us a lot that has been very helpful. You mentioned, and we talked a little bit about how China has paid an additional $1.8 million to the World Anti-Doping Agency. How common is it for a nation to pay more than its dues? Is that normal or not so much?
You know, I don't think it's all that normal. I know in the investigations that I mentioned earlier, they gave out of that 1.8 roughly extra money above their dues. 500,000 was earmarked for investigations. My understanding is that's the only money that was extra that went to earmark specifically for the investigations division. But there have been other opportunities where governments have given extra money to the World Anti-Doping Agency for a science project or to develop a new collection model or something along those lines. The other really rare thing that I'll mention is that WADA also had a private sponsorship. They had 2 private sponsorships. One that I'm referring to was with the Chinese sporting good manufacturer, Anta, that also has a sponsorship with the Chinese National Olympic Committee, as well as the Chinese National Swim Team and Swim Federation. So you can, obviously, the perception of the conflict, whether it's direct extra government money or it's a private sponsorship, which until now, and questions have been asked, no one's known what the value of that sponsorship was and what type of money. If it was money, they now say it was value in kind, and shirts or clothing was given for some of their staff. But we haven't seen the detail of that. And the optics of that just erodes the confidence, once again, the trust that athletes have. And again, I'm not saying there's a quid pro quo there, but clearly the perception of a conflict and having money on the one hand extra and sponsorships and then allowing China to sweep these tests under the carpet is incredibly troubling.
Right, and you've spoken quite a bit about some of what you would do. One of them you mentioned was a subpoena. And as a country who gives the most money, I would think that would be something that we would do, that we would say, hey, if we're going to give you money, you got to be here and answer questions. So thank you for bringing that up. You also brought up conditioning money. How would you condition the money? You talked a little bit about disclosure of documents and audit. How would you draft that? Just for our guidance on going back, as mentioned, to talk to appropriators, what kind of conditions on the money would you place?
Fantastic and incredibly important question. When Russia happened, the taxpayer money that went to the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, it was seen as a contract that had to be paid. Congress changed that. It's now discretionary. ONDCP, the director, Dr. Gupta, who sits on the executive committee at WADA, he and that office has the power to pay the money or not to pay the money. We would recommend very strong language in the reporting of that money and condition the payment of that money on the 3 things that I asked for, and there may be additional things that can be asked for, and make sure that the White House office, adheres to how Congress expects its taxpayer money to be spent, and ensure that we're spending it in the right ways. And make no mistake, we need and have to have a strong WADA, and maybe we need to pay more, but we should not continue to pay bad money after bad money when we've seen this pattern of behavior happen.
Well, great, thank you. I represent a district in Southern California, and so my district is going to have the Olympics come there, and swimming will be there, and so I'm super excited about it. But we don't want to have this hanging over our head either. We don't want to have athletes second-guessing the competition. And to hear today the athletes talk about the mental health impacts is something that is not talked about very often. and something that we need to continue to focus on and make sure that we're addressing this. So thank you so very much for all the witnesses and for the committee. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for your questions. I'm now going to recognize Ms. Castor for a few wrap-up questions. If you can stay with us just a couple more minutes, we're almost done. Thank you, Mr. Tygart.
Thank you, Mr. Tygart. Two just simple questions to wrap up. And thank you for recognizing the whistleblowers and the investigative reporters who have helped bring some of this to light. So the Summer Olympic Games in Tokyo, they were July 23rd, August 8th, 2021. Chinada had collected the samples from the Chinese swimmers that January and reported to WADA. Was that really done through the International Testing Agency and the doping control officers? What is that step that WADA actually received the reports about the Chinese swimmers?
Yeah, the Chinese anti-doping agency, Chinada, as we understand what's been reported, collected the samples, sent them to the Beijing laboratory that ran the samples. They were positive for these low levels of TMZ. They reported those as required into the ATOM system. So WADA and World Aquatics were on notice in March, as they've said, of these positive tests that were collected in early January of 2021.
Would there have been any way for them to when they went to the laboratory, for them to say, oh, they're all clean and no problem here? Or is there some check at the with the doping control officers or the testing agency or World Aquatics?
Well, certainly we saw in Russia, the lab itself was corrupt and was not doing the job that it was required to do. Here, the lab, and good for the lab, ran the samples and reported them to WADA. It then fell back to Chinada, who brought in the government to help them with the investigation, and they came up with this story that it was contamination. Then Chinada swept them under the carpet and didn't follow the rules that they were required to follow, and then sent that file as they're required to WADA, who was okay with it.
Okay, that's helpful. So the International Olympic Committee, they say right in their mission statement, I read it at the start of the hearing, that they exist to encourage and support the promotion of ethics and good governance in sport, to protect clean athletes and the integrity of sport by leading the fight against doping and by taking action against all forms of manipulation of competitions and related corruption. What can the IOC do now that this has come to light?
They could solve the problem tomorrow. They could remove themselves from the governing boards, so remove the fox from guarding the henhouse, and continue to fund and maybe also increase their funding, and let WADA be the watchdog, not their lapdog, when it comes time to enforcing the rules.
And what recourse since they have athletes that are headed to Paris, would there be some recourse there as well?
We have to get to athletes deserve justice, and it's not just U.S. athletes, other athletes that swam in the 2021 Olympics, and athletes who are going into the Paris Olympics for 2024. We have to get justice for those athletes. It's not fair for them to be haunted, as you heard from Allison Schmitt, for the rest of their lives, whether or not those athletes from China who had these positive tests should have been there or not. And it's why we need someone that understands the rules, that's given the freedom and the access to dive into the cases themselves, not a review of what WADA did, but actually get to the facts of the cases, prosecute the cases like we have called for from the very beginning, and get justice for all the world's athletes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I have a few follow-up questions. One, I thought it was a good point you made earlier that some of the Chinese swimmers did not test positive for the illegal substance, and they too were cheated.
That's right.
And so when you talk about the athletes of the world, it includes the Chinese athletes, or in the case of Russia, the Russian athletes who maybe didn't get that spot, that number 1 or 2 spot, because they were knocked out because of performance-enhancing drugs by some of their colleagues. We talked about how we give about $4 million to WADA. We talked about the International Olympic Committee being on the WADA board, and therefore you've got the fox watching the hen house. And I think it was in your testimony, but I don't want to put words in your mouth because it's been a long night and I don't know that I remember. But I believe in your written testimony you indicated that maybe NBC, as a major contributor of funds to the IOC, might have influence on this as well. Did I remember that correctly, or was that somebody else's?
I for sure made reference to the sponsors. Listen, it's you can look at the numbers. The U.S. companies, including NBC, that pays a lot of money to broadcast it in the largest market, most valuable market here in the United States, have a lot of influence at the IOC. We would hope the sponsors will listen to the athletes and finally say enough is enough, IOC, get this fixed. And it's a simple fix. Make it independent, have it do the right thing to try to win this for clean athletes, not just go through a charade where we pretend that we have clean sport, but actually provide clean sport. And look, I think we can say, and no country, and please do not misunderstand me, the U.S. included, we've had some of the most hardcore intentional cheaters. Look at the Lance Armstrong case. Go back to the Balco case. We removed 5 medals from one of our top athletes back in 2000. But you can win it, and you can raise a generation of athletes, like you've heard from today, who want to do it the right way. No kid on a playground grows up and says, I can't wait to be an Olympian so I can inject myself with dangerous drugs. It just doesn't happen. People want to win the right way. We know you're not a winner if you cheat to win, but we have to build a system that's fair and firmly applies without fear or favor to every country and every athlete what the rules dictate.
Well said. I yield back. I want to thank all of our witnesses, but particularly you, Mr. Tygart, since you're the only one left standing.
The lone survivor.
For your testimony today. Seeing there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I would like to thank our witnesses for being here. I would ask unanimous consent to insert in the record documents included on the staff hearing documents list. I don't think we have any, though, do we? Without objection, that will be the order. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to submit their responses within 10 business days upon receipt of the questions. Now, that said, this was a little bit of an experiment. Didn't work as well as I had hoped, but I've been advocating for at least 6 years, maybe 8, that we do night hearings. So thank you, Mr. Tygart. I appreciate our other witnesses who had to leave for participating in this experiment. I want to get it shortened up where we start at 6 and we end at 8:30, but we'll make it happen. Without objection, subcommittee is adjourned.